Hello, welcome to Headspace, Why the Future of Work is Employee Wellbeing. Thank you for joining this conversation. The session is part of the second annual Rising Economy Week, an immersive virtual and in-person event hosted by South Island Prosperity Partnership. This is just one of more than 20 sessions building momentum for a more resilient, innovative, sustainable, and equitable post-COVID world. I'm Calen McNeil from Big Burger. We're sponsoring this session. Employee well-being is very important to us as a company. It's something that we've wanted to do for a long time, and I think COVID has exposed a bunch of cracks that have been there for a long period of time. So I think businesses can do a lot to support their employees and staff, and by focusing on mental health, but also physical well-being as well. So I'm looking forward to this session. Our moderator today will be Erin Skillen. As the founder of Content for Good, Erin Skillen is a consultant, writer, speaker, and facilitator on a mission to create a better normal at work and beyond. She collaborates with businesses and organizations seeking to increase employee engagement and retention and improve team culture and inclusion. Erin's career journey has involved building an award-winning mental health startup from scratch, producing TV documentaries, hosting award shows, writing for Douglas Magazine, and more. Her work focuses on making a meaningful difference for leaders, teams, and the planet we share while having fun doing it. Welcome, Erin.
Hi, Calen. Thank you so much. And thank you also for the buffalo fries, which is a multifaceted experience of enjoying food and also getting a good sweat. So thank you for that experience. I just want to appreciate that. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I just want to bring my teammates on here today before we get rolling into the session. First of all, I want to introduce, if you have not met him already, Ian Chisholm, originally hailing from Saskatchewan, next door to me in Manitoba. He is a founder and partner at Roy Group, which is a leadership development firm that focuses on equipping an increasingly complex world with its next generation of mentors. Roy Group deploys research, experiential learning, team practice, and one-on-one integration to create teams of leaders that are capable of high performance, deep learning, and strong engagement. And before he ended up here in Vancouver Island in 2004, he led a very challenging operational startup of the award-winning Columba 1400 Community and International Leadership Center on the Isle of Skye in Scotland. So welcome, Ian.
Hey, Erin.
Hi, and then next on our panel, Dr. Paul Mohapel frequently designs courses and lectures for psychology and business programs at various Canadian and international universities. He's also an associate faculty at Royal Roads University Leadership Program, a certified facilitator and coach in emotional intelligence, and he currently uses his expertise in psychology, neuroscience, mindfulness, and leadership to help leaders and organizations function more effectively in the workplace. And Dr. Mohapel was the first recipient, the very first, of the Kelly Outstanding Teaching Award for Workshop Facilitation at Royal Roads University. So welcome, Dr. Paul Mohapel.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you both for being here today. So I am going to start this conversation with a few questions, but when we get to the halfway mark, that is your turn to ask questions. But don't worry, you can submit them anytime via the chat, and we have a lovely human on the other end of that chat who will help us answer some of those questions in the Q&A section. And you can also interact using Zoom or the Whova chat, as the production team will also be managing the Whova chat. And if you're posting anything about this session, please post about it. This is important. We want you to use the hashtag Rising Economy Week 2021. Okay, here we go. So other than the fact that I am hosting a public presentation wearing yoga pants, Ian, what are some of the other changes, some of the bigger picture changes that you've seen sort of pre-COVID and now? How are we changing in the workplace?
I mean, I think the conversation amongst colleagues about vitality is more common, partially because people have been test to fail. In engineering, that's a really important moment where we find out what something's capable of withstanding.
Yep.
And I think when I think about my team, we have all been tested to fail numerous times over the last 21 months. We're talking about it in a way that we never have before. We're finding ways to start again and kind of crawl out of that hole that we get ourselves into. It's the conversation that's kind of underneath everything, both on the mental health side and also the physical health side. And I can't help but think that that's the biggest change, and also something that's healthy in itself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know. So there used to be a layer where we would just be living our lives. For instance, maybe your
Right.
child woke you up at 4 a.m. and then that woke the puppy up and then woke the other child up. And that was enough what you had to deal with. Not that that happened to me this morning before this presentation at all. But now we have the additional layer of global pandemic and now, looking at climate emergency. So Paul, I'm curious what you can tell me about what is all of this doing to our brains?
Well, one of the things I do know, we're spending more time in front of screens than we did before the pandemic. And so we do know from before the pandemic that there were already literature coming out suggesting that excessive screen time was not good for our brains. There have been some studies that show that digital multitasking has actually led to loss of volume in an area called the prefrontal cortex. There's studies now coming out with children. There was just a study that came about a year and a half ago looking at preschoolers and noticing that if they were spending more than an hour at screen time, they were lost about a 60% loss of white matter formation in the brain, which is an important part of developing our cognitive abilities. And in that particular study, they showed drops in cognitive abilities in these children. So, generally, there's a wave of research suggesting that there's some downsides to be constantly in these hyperactive digital environments.
Doing too many things at too many times and impacting our brains negatively. Absolutely. And Ian, how are you seeing people's priorities as leaders changing in terms of focusing on employee wellness? What's their new mantra in that regard?
I think that the instincts that people first experienced last March, where suddenly there was this reason to check in with each other more often, has stuck with us. I don't know. Sometimes I wonder if life was maybe a little bit too easy before this all happened. And like you mentioned, it's not just the pandemic, it's everything that's happened in the last 20 months, which would cause a person to step back and go, this is a very unpredictable world that we are now in. And so in many ways, I think for a lot of leaders, their priorities have felt a little bit like driving through a blizzard. Being from Manitoba, you'll understand what I mean by that.
I get it. I totally get it. Yep.
Out here in Victoria, we might have to explain what that is. But when you're just looking out over the front hood of where things are going, and that means that the priorities have been in the realm of culture, in the realm of protecting whatever it is that we do for our clients that is valuable, and probably finding new ways to do that. I don't know how strategic a lot of business leaders have been able to be until for us, it happened in June, where we suddenly came to the clarity that we would like to come out of this better than when we went into it. And I think it took a year and a half to get used to driving through the blizzard, but when it started to clear, and some can say that that's subjective, but when it started to clear, there was an immediate appetite to kind of set some strategic priorities that are about improvement and about being different, and in fact being a better venture than we were when we came into this.
Absolutely. And Paul, part of all of this, of course, and that sort of limited point of view, is also that blurring of the lines between work and home, especially if you're here working from home, and or feeling uncomfortable about going into an office. What impacts are you seeing on sort of the mental health of people that are dealing with these sliding boundaries?
Yeah, I've noticed a huge increase in my own business, people asking for more emotional intelligence and resilience. I've never had so many demands ever, and I've been doing this for over a decade now, this kind of work. So one of the things I'm noticing is, again, this is sort of related back to the technology, is we used to have traditional boundaries of when you came home, you just transitioned out of work, you would rest. And one of the things we're seeing, particularly in the pandemic, is we're noticing there's literature that's supporting this. People are actually working longer hours because of the convenience. People, in fact, there's a remorse or a guilt that seems to be happening with employees. They're feeling, because of the convenience, because no one can really see if they're doing the amount of work, that people are actually working more rather than less. They're not taking advantage of it. They're actually, because of the convenience. So what's happening is that's spilling into their downtime. So one of the, I always call it this double hit. It's a huge hit to be in front of a screen in terms of the stimulation on your brain. It's excessive stimulation. And then we don't give ourselves sufficient rest, restorative time, because the brain needs off processing time to restore itself. So for example, studies have shown that if you take a walk through a forest, that has a tremendous restorative capacity, because it's calm, things are green, and the stimulation pulls back, and actually allows your brain to sort of restore itself. And you don't get the same effect if you're walking downtown in an urban center, because there's so much things coming at you, you have to keep constantly noticing. So this idea that our brain needs downtime, and I think technology has erased those boundaries, those natural boundaries that used to exist. And as a result, I don't think people are realizing, you might have heard of the boiling frog syndrome. If you throw a frog into a vat of boiling water, it will immediately leap out. I don't know if this is true or not.
We don't want to test it. We'll take your word for it.
But if you the saying is, if you put a frog in a cold pot of water and you slowly turn up the heat to boiling, the frog actually doesn't notice those small incremental changes, and it will actually stay there and boil itself to death. In a way, I sort of use that as an analogy of, over the years, we're spending more and more time in front of screens, and we're not really noticing the so incremental sort of the deterioration that we're experiencing.
So knowing that a lot of employees are dealing with this, what can we be doing as employers to help create those boundaries and maintain those boundaries with our teams?
So, one of the things we see that more progressive organizations are doing is they're actually establishing those. So they're making rules, no emailing after hours, for example, or there's no expectation to respond immediately to an email, or even reducing how we use email. I'm picking on email because that is the number one time waster at work. So the average knowledge worker, they're saying, spending about 30% of their day just navigating emails. And they say that, about 60% of those are unnecessary emails. So they, for example, every 100 people you CC on email that should not be CC'd, if you look at the amount of time that takes to process those people, it's about 8 hours of a person's time.
Yeah, it adds up for sure.
So offering like email etiquette is one good place. How we meet as well, we seem to be meeting excessively now, because it's easier now in the virtual environment. And so often we don't meet, we don't think about why we should meet. It tends to be a reflexive response to things. Oh, let's just meet and talk about it. And so, email and meetings are the two biggest areas. If you start to think about putting more boundaries around, that can have a huge impact in reducing the hours.
Yeah. And Ian, what are your thoughts on leaders who are sending those messages, maybe sending a text after hours, sending an early morning text, trying to keep business as usual? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think we are all plagued by a very North American mental model. And I know Paul, has worked overseas and has some great perspectives, so maybe he would jump onto this. But North Americans have an insipid belief somewhere very down deep inside that we create value by being hard workers. And that as leaders, we need to be a model of outworking everybody in our shop. That's why we're the leader. I'm definitely, I wrestle with this vice every day. I grew up on a farm. Hard work was the currency that gained you the respect of the people around you. If in my family, you made an observation that someone was a hard worker, they were automatically somebody to be revered. So there's decades and decades and decades of convincing ourselves of something. And I really think that the opportunity here is to move from that mentality of grafting, you demonstrate your prowess by being a hard worker, to a high performance mindset, and to think about some of the lessons that we've learned from high performance sport or entertainers, where, that peak performance level, when they get to use their natural gift, is surrounded by oceans of rest and preparation and rituals that allow that person to that when it's time to perform for an hour or 2 or 3 or 4, it's all orchestrated around that, and that you can't get that kind of peak performance by working all the time. I think leaders really need to embrace that and look to their teams to say, how can I actually get the best out of the people that I have that's better for them and better for the organization. And that does not involve surrendering to this default of there are conditions of adversity, and that means we're all going to have to work really hard to get through this. We have to start the conversation and become aware of just how incredible people are when we respect that potential that's inside them that can come out in the form of high performance if we change everything to invite that.
And in Iceland, they did a recent study on the 4-day work week, which was a resounding success. And now 85% of their working population is either on a 4-day work week or working towards a 4-day work week. Paul, why do you think that was proven so effective?
Well, just to build on that, there's other studies as well. In 2018, Melbourne in Australia published a massive decade-long study where they looked at almost 7,000 people, tracked them for a decade, and basically what they concluded was optimal peak performance is about a 25-hour work week. And they found, particularly if you're over the age of 40, if you exceeded 25 hours, your productivity starts to drop tremendously. And then if you exceed 35 hours, you doubled your risk for almost all physical and mental health ailments, cancer, depression, anxiety disorder. So, what they concluded was, this idea of working harder, as Ian was saying, particularly in North America, we have this like doing versus being. There's, we're so caught up on always doing and doing and doing. And so, there's this tension between quantity of work versus quality of work. And that we don't realize that there's a give and take between those two. When you start to increase quantity, quality starts to drop off. And so to introduce quality back, we have to pull back on the quantity. And so often we don't think in that dynamic way. We tend to be very simplistic about thinking push harder and harder and harder, but harder doesn't mean smarter. So, I love these studies because they really are challenging some of our distorted notions about what it means to be productive and to be effective. And never mind our well-being is, I think, is attached to that as well. Not only are we performing less effectively, we are actually taking a long-term toll, if you like. There's a cost associated with our long-term well-being and our lifespans connected with this.
So in tandem with unpacking that sort of hard work ethos, what about emotion? People are dealing with very difficult times. And Ian, do you think emotion has a place at work?
Yeah, no, a lot of the work that we do with high performance teams is about helping leaders in those teams to recognize that emotion is a very rich source of intelligence and information. And I'm sure it's happened to a lot of us that are working with teams that over the past 21 months, people have hit a wall and there's been tears, or there's been rage, or there's been like an outburst that the person wasn't expecting. And there it is in the room with you. And I think vitally important, then rather it's like another paradigm that emotion doesn't belong in a professional workplace, that professional means a void of emotion. I think we got to get past that. And leaders and team members have to have the kinds of questions ready, like, can you tell me a little bit about where those tears are coming from? And this is obviously really painful for you, what just happened, and I want to know why and what's going on. And immediately, start getting that information out on the table.
Yeah. And how does that, Paul, how does that tie into psychological safety and making it safe to have those discussions at work?
Well, I think this is such an important central issue. I agree with Ian. I think we have these distorted messages about emotions don't have a place at work. And emotions are they're just information, internal information that are meant to help guide us make good decisions and guide our thinking. And the moment we close the door off and say, well, it's inappropriate to have emotions in this arena of my life, we actually put ourselves at risk, because emotions give us valuable information to help us, navigate the complexity of life. And so one of the things I'm noticing as a trend that I think is alarming is it's almost the two extremes. It's emotions have no place, or emotions are bad, in the sense that if you make me feel a certain way, that is somewhat harmful. So we've sort of developed over the last decade or so, I've seen this trend of, if you make me feel a particular emotion that's uncomfortable, that is harmful to me. And, I think that's a very dangerous view, because emotions actually build our immunity. Experiencing negative emotions help us develop this skill set to handle more harsher or more extreme emotional states. So in a way that, if, there's literature showing that the younger generations are scoring much lower on resilience scores than previous generations. And one of the explanations is connected to parenting styles. As parents, we tend to maybe overprotect our children and try to buffer them from experiencing emotions when they're young, thinking that we're doing them a service, but we may be actually doing them a disservice. As we're seeing in the pandemic, is when now something happens that is extreme, we don't have the capacity to handle that. And I think it also relates to, this idea of harm, making me feel something is harmful. And I think that, I think the concept of harm has crept to a point where we've, it actually dilutes other things that actually are harmful, that should be addressed. And when people start to feel that experience of, well, you're making me feel a certain way. We've seen this in universities, students protesting to have, they often invite two people on a spectrum of an issue. And often students will protest one of those points of view because they view that as threatening. They don't agree with it. And so they don't even allow that individual to speak. So they're protesting. So as soon as we close that off, I think we lose the broad perspective. And I think it starts to drive polarization in our society, where we start to have to identify with one extreme or the other.
Yeah,
and I think this is related to the fact that we're unwilling to allow those emotions to have the discomfort of listening to viewpoints that we don't agree with. And it doesn't mean it's harmful. It just means it's uncomfortable.
Absolutely. So Ian, we know employers have some work to do to step up to help make their employee wellness a priority, to not only be better leaders, but also to improve engagement and retention. What do individuals, employees, what can we be doing? What do we need to bring to the table?
Yeah, I that's an awesome question. As Paul was talking about this fundamental difference between safety, which is different than comfort. And it would be, to me, pretty beige if we had a panel conversation and the message was, as employers, there's a long list of things and a long list of compromises that we have to make to be better bosses. This has got to be a two-way street. That's a safe thing to say. It may not be totally comfortable. Psychological safety is about like some very specific things. It's about the safety to feel included, the safety to learn, the safety to contribute, and the safety to challenge. Yeah. There's a lot that's uncomfortable in our work. And back to that high performance mindset, expectations are high, standards are high. When how somebody spends that other 15 hours of their week, the employer may have a say in that. To say, we're not going to be working, but we're going to be doing the sorts of things that allow us to be better at our work, maybe on our own, maybe together. But if I'm still paying you this salary, my expectation is that there's got to be a give and take here. So I want us to be better. I want us to be more vital, to feel more safe, to feel more resilient, and put the effort into having the kinds of habits in those extra 15 hours that make that 25 hours of work something really special and something that actually drives the company forward into awesome territory, not, a 75% version of what we've tried to accomplish in the past. That's not the expectation. It has to be better for the employer and for the employee. So I think it's a negotiation and an exploration of how could we be better.
I agree, definitely. Okay, so we are going to open it up to your questions. If you haven't already submitted a question, please submit it to the Q&A box and we will bring them to our panelists. So I have one here for you. Whomever wants to answer first, please go ahead. A challenge in today's workforce is for employers in small business like stores and restaurants to raise salary and benefits for their employees without going under if customers are unable or unwilling to pay a higher price for products and services. So, how do we help employees while keeping our businesses open? Who wants to take a bite of that one?
Okay, I'll try.
I have some thoughts. You go first.
I really think that if you're familiar with motivation in psychological research, 5 decades of research, one of the things that's really clear is that when people work, it's not just about money. Mm-hmm. It's not just about there has to be a baseline, but the thing that makes people shine and thrive in the workplace is more intrinsic motivation. It's contributing to something that is greater than ourselves. That's a human need, to want to be a part of something bigger. And I think sometimes, particularly when things are economically tough, we kind of revert to this sort of survival mode and realize that there's other things that keep people engaged and want to be employed in your business that aren't just salary or benefit related. Opportunities to get involved in multiple ways, having choice, maybe having input on how the business is run. I don't think we do enough as employers perhaps to tap into that human potential that people have a craving to want to contribute to. So, I think we maybe have to stop thinking about just salaries and start to think about how can I create a work environment that people feel that they can meaningfully engage, that they are doing something of value, of a greater purpose, meeting a need. And I think, maybe thinking about that, because if you think about the companies where people flock to, like Google, I'll give an example. I'm not saying Google's perfect by any means, but it's still in the last decade, the number one most desired place to work in North America. They get like 40,000 applicants a month. Why? Well, their salaries aren't, they're in median range in the industry. They're not paying a lot of money. What is attracting people? There's something about the culture, about the people wanting to be a part of something that's important. And so I think, businesses maybe need to start to think more in that way and not just, it's not just about the money. And I think employees will understand if you say to them, listen, this is the situation here. I'm being transparent, but, this is, how you could contribute, or this is what we could do.
Yeah, I think creative solutions are key and understanding, as you mentioned, motivation, because people are motivated by different things. For some people, maybe that's creating, instead of one full-time position, you have two people doing a half-time job share because they want to drop their kids off at school, or they want to be able to take a class, whatever that might be, but learning the individual motivations and finding creative solutions. And I will say as well, also, obviously coming from a mental health company, employee assistance programs can be an inexpensive way of providing access to mental health care for your team, far less expensive than paying for proper, full benefits to see a psychologist. So just looking at creative solutions, I think, outside of salary benefits. Ian, did you have anything to contribute there? Shall I move to the next question?
Well, just briefly, Paul mentioned earlier this polarized place that we've gotten to, and you just used the word creative. I think it is a leap of faith to get off that spectrum, that profitability is over here for a business and that people's effort is over here, that if we're going to work, everybody's tails off, that's what makes us more profitable. Now, it's easy for me to say. I happen to be in a business where this has been true for me, that in June, we were able to say, I think our company could be more profitable. I think our lives could be healthier. And I think rather than spending, 3 nights a week in airports, we could do more things online in combination with what we do in person and having people in different places. Like, if you're prepared to take the faith and say, actually, I want us to be more profitable and therefore creating more cash to pay people more, provide better benefits, make a stronger culture that attracts even more good stuff. And we're not going to accomplish that by just putting elbow grease in. We're going to do that conceptually. Let's get creative and just say, we want this organization to be a vehicle for better lives, and we want it to be more profitable. Wanting both of those things is totally valid and can become a conversation for the entire company.
Right. So following on that, the next question, the pandemic has caused people to reevaluate their lives and prioritize their goals and well-being over working. This has caused a shift in the labor market where employees have more demands for roles and employers have to offer more. Do you think this is something that will pass? Is this temporary, or will this be prevalent well into the future? Paul, what do you think?
Well, that's a tough one. That requires a crystal ball. I do believe that if this will pass, we will be different from it. I think our perspective has shifted. I think we're already seeing that throughout society, focus on multiple things, equity, diversity, this idea of more inclusion. And I think it's hard for me to predict if that's going to stay or not, but I would like to think that we can use this, what we learn from this challenging times, to maybe rethink about how we do things, in our businesses in terms of how we serve society. And so I think, I always think this is an opportunity. There was always a threat. Threats always are associated with opportunities. That's it's when the things loosen up, that's when new things can grow, when the pavement cracks, so I'm really optimistic that we can, and I hope that we don't revert back to the old ways. I hope that we take this opportunity through all this discomfort to actually learn something from it that we can apply and maybe rethink. And as Ian said, I think we need to challenge some of the old concepts. I think that this has already started to happen, but I think we need to continue. I mean, there may be a tendency to want to go back to the way things were, but the way things weren't great. And I think, to remember that, and that we can maybe do something different.
And it really depends on the results, doesn't it? If working towards shared profitability and employee well-being works together and proves to be a better model, then yeah, why wouldn't we want it to stick around? I think the proof is going to be in the pudding there. Ian, any other thoughts on that?
Just the fact that the pandemic was meteoric, not just because it came out of nowhere, but because it really ruptured the bedrock of people's lives. And they realized what was important. It's a terrible metaphor, but when the tide goes out, you get to see who's got trunks on and who doesn't. And I think a lot of companies that had strong cultures, that have found ways to let people know, not just saying it, but that people know that they are cared about and that they belong. I don't think those companies have lost a lot of people. Maybe practically somebody needed to change things around, but I think we found out who had a real culture of belonging and who actually was pretty thin on that front. So when the tide comes back in, will there be companies with thin cultures again? Absolutely. And if you're working in one of those, that's your choice. I think this has been a test in that way. And also the companies that chose to use what's happened, the pandemic, this flashpoint that was, the murder of George Floyd, the 215 in Kamloops, like these waves of things that have hit our consciousness in the wake of the meteor. Some companies are using that to deepen their culture, even though it's not comfortable. And some companies are skating on top, and they're just trying to keep things as comfortable as possible for people. And some of those companies will come out stronger, and some of them will come out without even realizing the opportunity that they just passed up.
Exactly. And if culture isn't, strong at an organization, and it is just those salary and benefits, you're now competing in a global marketplace with remote work, and any old global company could come along and scoop up your workers if they don't have that attachment to more than just the numbers and the transaction. Absolutely. So another question here about compassion. How do we demonstrate the importance of practicing compassion as leaders? How do we work towards a culture of compassion, especially at work? Paul, you want to take that one?
Sure, I'd love that one. I'm a true believer of that we need more compassion, but I'm not sure we sometimes understand what that means. And coming back to the point of being uncomfortable, a lot of compassion requires to hold the space for discomfort. Particularly, again, it's easy to be compassionate to someone you agree with and like, but compassion is not meant to be selective. It is the ability to hold space, particularly in people that you don't agree with, that you don't hold the same views, and to have, to stay connected on the level of this is a human being that needs, that ability, that space, if you like, without judging. So, I often define compassion as the ability to suspend the need to judge somebody or their personality or their based just on their behavior, and give them more of that tolerance. Because what I'm noticing is I feel that's not enough happening, is there's a lack of tolerance happening. I find that people fly off the handle quite quickly. If someone uses the wrong terminology, there's often an assumption of bad intention. That seems to be the reflexive reaction. And I think that's driven a lot by social media. I think social media panders to that reflective sort of reaction. And so, to me, I define compassion as the ability to have that tolerance without jumping and assuming bad intentions, and allowing that, and noticing that people are at different places and different spots. And, I do a lot of mindfulness-based training, and mindfulness is sort of the essence of compassion, because mindfulness is bringing attention to something, even if you don't like it, and staying with that and giving it your full focus.
So Ian, how can we weave that compassion into our leadership style?
Well, I just love what Paul said. I don't know if I can add on that, but it's the opposite of judgment.
Yeah.
And so what does it mean to be a leader who has the kind of approach that is calling itself when it snaps to judgment, and replacing that with compassion? Any work in coaching, any work in conflict, any work in great design comes from, this really empathetic place of, no, let's not just come up with ideas. Let's really put ourselves into the shoes of the people that might need this and really experience their pains. The biggest example for me of compassion in my life, which I look to a lot, is, the woman I married, who's a mediator and has this wonderful expression of understanding is not the same as agreeing. Mm-hmm. So that I can, regardless of what comes my way, even though I probably am quick to judge it, and I mean that, like I am probably quick to judge that in relation to her, learning that I can actually put effort in to help my opponent articulate themselves better than they have ever articulated themselves before. And that doesn't mean that I have to agree with them. The only reason we judge is to say, I don't agree with that. Mm-hmm. That's not the way I'm built. That person is different from me. And I just think it's a pattern. It's one of these resilience habits that will make us more resilient if we have default settings that send us into that place of being curious and understanding. It happened for me when the pandemic hit. Some of our team members got really hungry to get through this. It was almost like they came home and they got off planes and they're like, let's do this. This is going to be big and we are going to be great. Mm-hmm. And I just love that so much. I judge that as the way to get through a pandemic. Some people needed to time out. They wanted to be with their family. They did not want to think about clients. They really stepped back. And I was hugely judgmental of that deep down inside. Anne-Marie really helped me kind of get through that. And 3 weeks later, I was totally exhausted and needed to step back to get some perspective and to check in with my family I just think it's a wonderful habit to make space for, and you get the space for it by catching yourself being highly judgmental.
And what do you think are the key communication strategies that employers can be using with their teams? Like what are the key takeaways if they need to sort of think about, okay, how do I support my team during this time? How do I communicate? What are some of the most effective strategies to think in that regard? Paul, do you have any ideas there?
Well, yeah, I think it comes back to the making a space for emotions to be expressed. Emotions just need an outlet. The problem with emotions is the emotions themselves is how we often orient or position ourselves with them. So if we feel anxiety or frustration, if we don't have a natural, healthy outlet for that, then that tends to manifest in very maladaptive ways. So I think, as employers, to give that space, that avenue to talk about how you doing, checking in with people. I think more now than ever, we need to check in with the people, because of what's happening, and give people that space to have those honest conversations. And emotion, just because we talk about it doesn't mean, sometimes we feel like, oh, we're talking about it is going to make it worse. But that is a distorted view. Emotions just need a release. They just need space to expand out, and then they dissipate out. So communication around the affect is really, checking with people how they're, and also as a leader or an employer, to share your own emotional reactions. I think it helps other people then process their own, and you're modeling that behavior for others by you're allowing that space and that openness to talk about those feelings.
One of the greatest expressions I've learned over this year is, as human beings, we tend to want to fix things. So you say, I'm struggling with this, and I say, oh, this is what you need to do. Here's a link. This is what I did.
Yeah.
Really, the phrase that works, and this works at work and at home, do you want support or solutions? And giving the other person that opportunity to say, I just want support. I just want to vent. I just want to unload and walk away. Or maybe they do want solutions, but in my experience, 99% of the time, they're just looking for the support.
And often our drive to want to give solutions is our own discomfort. We're trying to fix it. Emotions aren't something to be fixed. Relationships aren't things, or we tend to view things as, endpoints, but, those are dynamics. Those are polarities of life that, they're always in flux. And so emotions can't be fixed. They can't be solved. We can't solve it for anyone else. So often our tendency to fix is trying to exert some sort of sense of control over something that inherently you can't control.
Just so frustrating. So annoying. Question here. We're talking back about boundaries. The time I used to spend commuting, I now spend working. And the delineation between work and home, in quotation marks, is blurred. What are some strategies I can employ to balance this better and draw clear boundaries between work and life? Ian, any thoughts? What have you learned through these times?
No, I think it's very interesting. In Canada, with fewer and fewer people taking part in organized religion, which we could argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But what we are missing is this attachment to ritual. And I think, as Paul will know about in his work around complexity, you need to create rituals for people so that something as simple as a different set of clothes or a different set of shoes, or engineer a commute, plan to go get groceries at the end of the day. So you are in your car, making a loop, getting some groceries, coming back, and now this is your home. It sounds quite strange, but human beings are wired to flip switches with the help of ritual. Now this is what this means. And so every cell in my body knows that, because I've put on that different pair of shoes, or I've put on, we really, ritual is very, very powerful. And we have to be careful that in this Zoom world, we're not losing our sense of ritual and helping other leaders, do something together, make that commute together, go for a walk every day at 4:00, or, just help each other ritualize things that flip that switch.
Yeah, without structure, we can be lost sometimes. We need that. We need
Absolutely.
that foundation. Paul, what do you think? What boundary recommendations do you have?
Yeah, I totally agree with Ian. Ritual is so important. So here's some other pragmatic tips. Don't work in the same place where you relax. Often we carry our computers. What happens is your brain develops cues. And so what you might notice is when you're sitting in your living room, if you work in your living room and you're trying to then unwind, part of you is going to be thinking about work because the cues are there. Because where you work, your brain starts to imprint that. So, I work a lot at home before the pandemic, so I have a separate office space upstairs away from where I relax. Simple things like that. creating, devices. I'll talk about creating boundaries and rituals with our devices. So when we come home, we have a little table in the hall that we put our phones on. We don't walk around in the house with our phones, because the phones, let's face it, often are cues to remind us of work that we should be doing. And so, creating physical spaces in your house to segregate out, it can be a very effective, another effective way to sort of help create those boundaries, if you like. We have to reestablish them, in other words, because we've lost them. And we didn't realize just how important they were until they went away. So to create some intentional boundaries, like stopping work at a certain time, starting work at a certain time, still taking a lunch break. Instead of eating in front of your computer, take an hour off and go to the kitchen and don't eat in front of your computer, right? Those are simple things. Take a break as if you're at work. If you had a 15-minute break scheduled, take that 15-minute break and physically remove yourself from the environment where you work.
My kids busted me last night. We have a rule, no phones at the table. And I had a deadline I was working on. I picked up my phone and they said, "Mommy, no phones at the table." I was like, oh shit, but also that's awesome. But for some people, space can be a consideration and delineations can be tricky. My space right now, my living room is right there. I'm in the same space. But what I do, I have a physical dog crate that I block and I do not touch this desk. This desk is not used for video games. That's over there. It's not used for anything fun. I love my work. It's for fun work, but not fun social times. There's definitely a difference. Okay, and Ian, you recommended a great book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. So everybody, go and get that book, please. Buy it locally. Okay, one more question. I was wondering if we were going to go here, and we're here now. Are you ready for it? The unvaccinated 10% impact workplace well-being. What are best practices to coexist with COVID in the workplace and workforce? Employees may want to work in a business like a store or restaurant that has a fully vaccinated workforce to protect themselves and their families. In many cases, the customers are fully vaccinated and the coworkers, but this can become stressful for the employer and the employees. So this is a wild thing we never had to deal with before. So how do we manage those layers of stress? Go ahead, Paul.
That's another tough issue. I mean, I have strong opinions about this, but that doesn't mean they're rooted in anything. But I think we have to come back to compassion. One of the things I think is really important is back to that idea. If someone has a fundamentally different viewpoint around vaccination, I think you're more likely to influence them to maybe broaden their perspective by having a compassion stance towards them, of truly trying to understand them. Again, not agreeing, but you can understand. And so, I've encountered some people in my lives that were on the fence around getting vaccinated, and I noticed that without bringing judgment to that or trying to shame them, I really tried to understand what their hesitancies was. And I found that more often than not, that stance actually led them to make it, I think, which was a better choice, eventually getting vaccinated. So I think, again, because a lot of people are forming their opinions in a distorted medium, which is the social media, I think it doesn't really allow for good empathy or compassion. And so, those face-to-face conversations, listening to people, I think that's the stance that I find has worked for me.
And Ian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would just, as you've given me the chance to do many times, to say, I agree with Paul. I agree with Paul. He's a pretty smart guy. I do think there's something else that is important to create health, generally, culturally, and within people, and to create that sense of belonging on your team. Of course, to lead with compassion and to find out more about all of the reasons why somebody might be making a choice. And then when the time is right, the most wonderful thing about, being curious and non-judgmental and asking and sending a message straight to that other person's heart that I care about you as a person and I'm interested in where you're at with this. It also generates some curiosity on their part about where you stand. And when you as a leader get a chance to speak with conviction about what you think is fair, the choices that you are making for your business and why you're making those choices, I just, polish it up and put it on the table. And being compassionate and understanding does not mean being inarticulate or willy-nilly when it comes to your convictions. You've created the space for that other person to express what their interests are deep down. You understand those interests, and now it's time for you to understand what I need to do and what's fair for me as a leader of my company. And getting yanked around by, somebody who feels a deep conviction to remain unvaccinated, that would be at odds with the way I'm running my company. And so this conversation, this exchange may result in, I think it's best that we're done. That's also fair.
Mm-hmm. Ian, do you think there still is people misconstruing that kindness is weakness in leadership?
I don't know. That'll be very interesting coming out of this whole experience. I think in other countries that face, an occupying force on their streets every day, that face disease, that face tremendous loss, that face racism, that face, I think we see kindness shows up a lot more in those places, and that leading is not always, but on the street, that the head of state may not be a very kind person, but the people who are making things happen in community, kindness is not seen as a weakness. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think we're losing that. I think we're letting that go away. As long as we keep the ability to say what's fair and what's really unkind is a lack of clarity.
Absolutely. And one last question here. A recent study by Leanan and McKinsey and Company found that the mission critical work of supporting employee well-being and promoting diversity, equity, inclusion is being done disproportionately by women who aren't being rewarded or recognized for it. I've heard it being called pink jobs before. So companies are getting rewards from these efforts, but they're taking a toll on women who tend to be statistically more chronically stressed at work. So how do you think leaders can step up to recognize this invisible work and help disseminate the burden of doing this employee wellness work? Paul, what are your thoughts?
Well, I'm seeing, at least from my experience recently, that is moving out more. I think that's less accurate probably now than it was maybe a year ago even. So I'm hopeful because I'm seeing more people pick up the baton of talking and servicing these issues. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important that everybody is engaged in this conversation. But I think we have to be careful to ensure that we allow that space for people to have that conversation, because my fear is sometimes that conversation gets narrowed into a particular stream that you have to, these are the boundaries of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so I think as we as more of us take responsibility of that, it starts to get less associated with a certain group, like a gender or a certain ethnic group that has to be driving that. And my hope is, and I'm seeing signs of that is starting to shift, and that people are reflecting more on this. But we have to ensure to keep that momentum, that we be careful not to engage in, back to the kindness thing. I think sometimes I've had experience where people justify unkindness because of that person to them represents a perspective or a worldview that they think that they embody, that they don't agree with. And that justifies an unkind or a shaming approach, for example. I find shaming is kind of rampant right now as a tool to influence. And the literature is very clear. Shaming never leads to any behavioral change. So making someone feel bad about their perspective or viewpoint never helps them shift. It actually entrenches them more in that viewpoint. So I think it's important that we keep that in mind, to sort of, we all pick up that, we all take responsibility. And in doing so, we have to allow that to continue. We need to remember to stay kind in this process.
Well, that is a great place to end up. So today we have had the pleasure of looking at the value of kindness, compassion, and empathy to help our employees navigate these challenging times and beyond, the value of work outside of salary and benefits, looking at performance being tied to more than just hours and hard work, but looking at rest and rejuvenation as key experiences in that. And again, I'm just going to say it because I might save a marriage here. Do you want support or solutions? You're welcome. So with that, I want to thank Ian Chisholm of Roy Group and Dr. Paul Mohapel for being here today. And I want to turn it back to the South Island Prosperity Partnership team.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you to all our speakers for joining us today. And thank you to Big Wheel Burger for sponsoring this important conversation. And finally, thank you to our presenting sponsor, RBC, and our innovation sponsor, BC Ferries, for supporting Rising Economy Week. We hope you've enjoyed today's morning sessions, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you all and have a good day.